old Partain Jr.
And where and when were you born?
I was born in New Orleans in 1918, February 21st, 1918.
Tell me a little bit about your childhood and what your parents did.
Well, my father was an investment banker, and my mother never worked. She never wrote a check in her life. She took care of kids, and there were four of us, and my father, I had great parents, and that's about it as far as they're concerned, I suppose. Uh,
Does anything stick out in your mind about? Did you grow up in New Orleans?
no, no. I was in New Orleans just to be near my mother. I was born there, but 10 months old we came back to Atlanta, and my father had a branch office there, and that's why we were in New Orleans. My parents liked to go to the horse races, and they liked the atmosphere in New Orleans, the wine, the food, and all of that. So they were in New Orleans at the time I was born.
Um,
I was born the Touro Infirmary, and I went back to it and visited it when I was 85.
how old were you when you went into service?
I was 23 in 1941. I was living in Buckhead, and I was the first draftee from Buckhead. I volunteered. It was based on an order number, national, I suppose, lottery, and my number was 104, so I knew that I'd be called almost immediately, so I volunteered, and it was in January of 41, and we had an Elks Club in Buckhead at the time, and they gave me a big dinner, and I had a police escort out to the post, Fort McPherson, and I took my own car, and when I got out there, they of course told me to fall in, and I told them I got this car, and the sergeant told the officer that one of them had a car on the post, and he came over and he said, "I'll give you till 5 o'clock today to get that car off the post." And so I called my father, and he came and got it.
During right around the time you enlisted, a little before and a little after, what were your sentiments about what was going on in Europe and the Pacific at that time?
Well, of course, when I went in, it was for 1 year, and of course it wound up being a little over 5 years, but all of us thought we were going in for 1 year, and of course we thought here's a war going on, but we'll never be in it. We thought that was for Europeans, and of course in December of 41 we learned differently, but it was something that we didn't pay a lot of attention to. We read the newspapers, and we then knew it was going on there, but we weren't too concerned. I was more concerned with chasing women.
When you heard that Pearl Harbor had been attacked, do you remember where you were and how you felt?
I sure do. It was on a Sunday, and I was at home, my parents' home on Wyuka Road, and I heard that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. Well, I wasn't sure where Pearl Harbor was at the the time, but I soon found out. And I remember I returned to the post, and of all the activity you can imagine at the post, they were sending soldiers out to various water points and to the reservoir and to public buildings downtown where the government had offices, and it was a beehive of activity. And of course, here I was in civilian clothes. We could wear civilian clothes back then, and so I finally found out that just exactly what was going on. And at that time, I was a sergeant, and I was in the service 4 months. You had to be 4 months before you could draw sergeant's pay, and I became a sergeant after 2 months and skipped PFC and corporal, and I was made a sergeant. I really cheated a little bit to get to that rank. I had an old first sergeant who was a prince of a guy, but he was easygoing, and he just didn't pay a lot of attention to administration. And I was the company clerk, and so he said, "Now we got all these ranks that just came in, and I want you to figure them out and tell me what you'd like to have." And you know these men pretty well, so I did, and I typed all up, and I put myself in as a sergeant. And he jumped up and down and threw his hat down. He cussed and ranted. He said, "You got nerve enough to put yourself in a sergeant? You haven't even had basic training." And so he said, "Well, if you've got that much nerve, I've got enough nerve to leave it as is and make you a sergeant." And so when I got to OCS a year later, reading my file, my tactical officer, and he said, "You were a sergeant, and you weren't a corporal?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, whose fair-haired boy were you?" And I said, "Well, I don't know about that, but anyway, that's the way it was." And I had more prestige at Fort McPherson as a sergeant than I did as a full colonel later on. That was quite a prestigious rank to hold back in those days.
In the time you were in the Army before Pearl Harbor, just briefly, what sort of things did they have y'all doing?
Well, I started out as a typist. I really faked that because I had 2 fingers, but I had been a newspaper reporter, a sports writer for the Atlanta Journal, and I had considerable speed for 2 fingers, and I was able to type about as fast as most people who had typing training. And so at first, and then they reviewed my file and saw that I had newspaper experience, and so I became assistant to the public information officer, Lieutenant Cox, and I was then assisting him. Well, they had a big fire at Fort McPherson. The stable burned, and Lieutenant Cox was killed in that fire. It was a brick stable, and a wall fell on him and killed him. And then there was no PIO at Fort McPherson, and so then they had me as an MP, and for a while, I chased prisoners about 8 hours a day, and then walked guard duty at night. And this same sergeant that I was telling you about, he was a good fellow, but he just didn't know how to run a duty roster, and he would put me on, and I'd have to walk post all night and chase prisoners all day, and it was just absolutely brutal. But that didn't last too long. Finally, a captain came in who had been captain of the guard at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, and he was called to active duty, Captain Curtis Reed, who later had a big job in Washington before his death. And he came in, and he ran things like they should have been run, and I continued to be in the military police until I went to OCS, Officers Candidate School at Fort Benning. I was in class 10, and they were just starting, and so I'll never forget going before the board, the selection board for OCS, and they asked me one question, I remember, where is Russia? And I said, well, Russia's in Europe. Are you sure? I said, well, really, Russia's in Europe and Asia. I said, most of the population is in Europe, but it extends to into Asia too. And that's the one question. And I went back and told my company commander, I said, I'm not sure about that question. I said, I don't know whether I failed it or not. And he said, well, who was on the board? And I told him, I said, well, Captain McCrary, Captain McKeever, and Lieutenant Reynolds. He said, well, you go tell Spence McCrary to pass you. If he doesn't, I personally will beat his so-and-so. And so I said, well, I can't tell him that. But fortunately, I was selected, and so I went to OCS at Benning, and that lasted 3.5 months. And it was a rough time. I hate to bring this up, but the barracks that we were in the Harmony Church area, and all of them had bed bugs in the walls of the old barracks, and we'd sleep at night with a flashlight fighting bed bugs, and then of course we'd drill all day. And I had a friend who was there at the same time I was, and he carried those things home in his laundry, and he was married, and so it wasn't all peaches and cream, but we finally, and I remember the day that I graduated, they called me back and they said, you have graduated already, but you shouldn't have. I said, why? And they said, because you've got a problem with your ears. You've had mastoiditis with your ears. And I said, well, I did, but that's over. I don't have any problem now. And he said, well, it was all right for you to be an enlisted man, but not an officer. And I said, well, so be it. So he finally said, well, just forget it. We'll go ahead and skip over that one. And so then I was sent to Camp Forest, Tennessee, as second lieutenant with the 827 Tank Destroyer Battalion. And it was a black outfit. All the troopers were black. And it was quite an experience. Most of them were uneducated, and in fact all of them were uneducated. And we would try to teach radio theory and so forth, and you'd look out and half the class was sound asleep, and it wasn't all easy. And when I got with white troops later on, it was quite a difference, quite a change. But I moved around, and I became a first lieutenant in about 6 months, and in 11 months I became a captain, and then I went back to Fort Benning to the Staff and Command course and took that, and several other courses like short courses like Pioneer, and I wound up being the, well, I say wound up, but at one time I was the company commander of a reconnaissance company, and later I was the adjutant of the outfit, and I got sick and had to go to the hospital, and we were on desert maneuvers out in the Mojave Desert, and so I had to have surgery, and when I recovered sufficiently, I was in the hospital 5 months, and when I recovered sufficiently, the unit had gone, and they'd gone overseas, so I was sent to Camp Roberts, California, and I was given a company there, and this was good duty. I enjoyed that.
What type of company was it?
It was an infantry company, and it was an infantry training company. We took people who were drafted and tried to make soldiers out of them by training them, giving them basic training. And incidentally, I never had basic training. I remember when I went to OCS, first time I'd ever drilled, and so they put us out the first day to drill, and this sergeant kept telling me to pull your butt in, and I didn't know what he meant. I didn't know that a rifle had a butt, and I thought he meant mine, so I started sort of walking funny, and finally he came over and said, I said, pull that butt in, and then I was introduced to a rifle butt the first time, but I skipped right over the basic training, never had it, and luckily I had two fellows on either side. One was named Bisman, the other Pennycook, and they kept me straight, and toward the end of the period of OCS, they made me the platoon commander, and by that time I had sort of caught on to it, so I got through that okay. But as far as marching, well, I went to Emory, and we had no ROTC training there, and so I had just never done that, but I got through it all right. And so while I was at Camp Roberts, California, I got orders to go overseas, and we were going to the Pacific, and at first we went to Fort Ord, California, and there we were outfitted with what we needed and so forth, and we took a general ship overseas. We had 5,000 troops and only sleeping quarters for 1,500, and so we had to alternate, at least the enlisted men did, for the bunks. You assigned 3 men to a bunk, not at the same time, but they would sleep in ships going overseas so that they could carry more. And I know that when my quarters, we had 12 captains in one stateroom, 12 bunks around, and in the middle was a table with a poker game going 24 hours a day, night and day, and you had to sleep with a bright light, that poker going on, and the various arguments, the poker, and you had to sleep through that. And quite a contrast coming back. We had the same thing, poker game going, and it was a different feeling entirely, because I remember one case, a Puerto Rican lieutenant, there was an argument about a pot in the poker game, and he scooped it up, several $1,000s, and carried it over and dropped it in a porthole in the ocean. He said, "Now that settles that one deal." And instead of throwing him overboard, which we would have done going, we all just laughed like everything. It was funny, because it's all the difference in the world and the feeling at the time. But we first went to, we were 23 days and nights going overseas, single ship, zigzagging, and I'll never forget one night they turned off all the lights and all the motors, everything, and we just sat there. And the word was that a Japanese submarine had spotted us, and so I always questioned the fact that we, instead of trying to outrun the submarine, they would sit in duck there for hours, and we were not allowed to talk above a whisper even. But finally, the next day, they resumed the voyage, and we went to first Finchhaven down in southern New Guinea, and they apparently weren't expecting us, so we then turned and went to the northern part of New Guinea, to Hollandia, and so we unloaded in Hollandia, and the entire ship load unloaded there, and we went out into the jungle and pitched tents, and in New Guinea you have rain. You've never seen a rain like New Guinea. It's just like pouring it in buckets. and it would come about the same time every night. And they have, I've forgotten what they call it, but there's a name for it. It's in a season where you have a rainy season, and you could be in the company street and see your footlocker floating out of the tent due to the rain, and so we hung around for maybe a month, and then I got bored, and so finally went to the commander of the, I guess you'd call it the area, and I told him, I said, I'm used to being active, and is there anything I can do that keep busy? And he said, yeah, as a matter of fact, there is. He said, we got a company commander we're having a problem with, and he's weak, and would you like to have a company? And I said, anything. So he said, well, we'll give you this company, and so they put me in the company as the commander and kept the lieutenant, who was the commander, still as part of my unit. So he wasn't too happy with it. But what we did, we all of the troopers that were returned from combat, we were to retread them and retrain them and send them back into combat again. And so I had 4,000 people in my company, and we fed, it took us about 8 hours to feed, and we did it in shifts, just constant feeding, and so it was quite an experience, because we had all kinds of suicides, and the slightest bomb that went off, they'd jump under the cot or something, and just a lot of men, some who were faking it, and some who were not. Some just were psychoneurotic, and it was quite an experience. So,
and for the record, a company is supposed to be just a little over 100 men, correct?
well, the company then was about 200 men,
Okay.
and but we had 4,000, and we were trying to train them and put them back. And of course, our area was downhill. There wasn't really a place where you could drill people, a flat area, and so we used the roads, and of course when a truck would come, we'd have to go to the side, and so we then we this went on for a while, and then we moved to the Philippines, and this I had a colonel, Colonel Solomon, who was my commander, and he came to me and he said, Jack, I don't want you to go with us up to the Philippines. I want you to stay behind, and I'll give you a compliment, and I want you to clean this place up. I want it to look just like it did before we ever moved in here. And he said, be sure that everything is just like it was. And he said, I'm going to leave that up to you to do that. And so they loaded up for the Philippines. And while they were en route, the LST that I was going to be on was hit by a Japanese submarine and was cut in two, and everybody was lost on this particular boat, and so back after I got home, you remember those letters I used to get from people all over the country who would write me, want to know how so-and-so happened to die and so forth. Well, I didn't know. I didn't remember exactly how some of them did, so I just couldn't tell them anything. And when we were at Fort Ord, we signed each other's wills. You had to sign a will, and you gave your name and address, and a lot of them got my name that way.
Sorry.
Then we went to the Philippines, and we were given the assignment to prepare a camp for retreads from Italy. The 92nd Division was moving in, and so to prepare to go to Tokyo later, the invasion of Tokyo, and or I say Tokyo, I meant Japan, not necessarily Tokyo, and so we were we built this camp, and we worked very hard trying to do this, and then we started receiving the soldiers from Europe who were coming over, and we had a lot of problems with them because, as you probably know, the 92nd Division was black, and there was strife even back then in the Army, and we had fights and all kinds of things happened. So, but we did receive them, and the Army takes a lot of pride in serving a hot meal to people just arriving. So we served them all a hot meal when they would arrive, and then we moved from down to a little town called Columba, and the Columba had quite a history. It seems that the Japanese came in there, and they had a term that they used. I've forgotten the term. Anyway, it meant that they were collaborators with the Americans, and so the Japanese went in there, and they, some woman, I mean, this I can't vouch for because it was rumor, but some old lady said that they were all collaborators, and so they moved down all the men in the village and left the women. And when our troops went in, and this is more hearsay, I'm not sure it happened, but they say when our troops took the Philippines, they burned this woman at the stake because she had caused this. Anyway, we were in this town, Columba, and we soon moved to another town called Angeles, spelled Angeles, and it was very close to Clark Field, and the Japanese were still, there were snipers that were even then shooting at us, and you couldn't go into the town of Angeles at night because it was very dangerous to do it. And then we went to Clark Field, which was very close. That was a very large field, and in it there was Schofield Barracks, well-known training area, and
I'm sorry. When this was going on, about when was this, and what unit were you with at the time?
well, this was in I would say April of 1945, and that's about the time, April of 45, and they at Clark Field we ran into a lot of we called them flyboys, Air Force people, and of course the Army started out as the Army Air Corps, and then it was changed to the Air Force, and anyway we called them flyboys. So we ran into them and mingled with them, and they, about I guess as late as July of 45, they would bet you that the war would be over in 30 days. And we thought, good night, we'll take all that bet. And so they knew something. We didn't know what, but it was preposterous that that you could even think that the war would be over. We didn't think the war would be over, but it just about was in about 30 days, in August of 45. I think that was the end of the war, and of course the truce was signed on battleship Missouri in I think about September the 2nd of 45, and there are many experiences that we had that I could go into. I remember the first day that I arrived in New Guinea. There was a lieutenant named Chalk, and he was telling me about MacArthur. General MacArthur had built a castle up on a mountain, and that engineer battalions built the road up, and they all got up a petition to get out of the Army and all because of that. And so I said to him, well, where is it? And he said, oh, it's down the road there about 40 miles. And I said, well, let's go see it. And he said, oh, well, okay. So we got in a Jeep, and we were going to see this castle up on Mount Olympus, they called it. And so we, on the way, we stopped at Lake Santani, and a trooper came over in a little boat and said, my buddy just fell overboard, he never came up. And this Lake Centenni was so full of algae and pollen that you couldn't see 2 inches, and it just wasn't anything in the world we could do. And so just it was tragic, but you was somewhat hardened to it already, because and we had another thing that happened a few weeks later. The new people coming over were told not to swing on the big vines they had in the jungle, and they would do it. And in fact, I remember one instance, a trooper came over, and the same day he arrived, he got killed swinging on a vine. The vine broke, and down he fell in a ravine and killed him. It was a tragic way to go. But anyway, to get back to our trip to Mount Olympus, we went up this road. It was a mud road. It was nothing great. And we got up, and I would say that this so-called castle on Mount Olympus was, it would have cost at least $1,000 to build it. And it was just a wood structure with screen wire around it, and this was the GHQ headquarters for the whole area. General MacArthur, who was the commander-in-chief of the whole area, was his headquarters. And it's just a big lie that a rumor mill had caused, that, and there was nothing to it at all. And we later, I got a message to report up there, and I went up there, and they had me cool my heels for a while, and finally this general came in and said, I want to talk to you. Said, I've got a couple of officers, you and one of them, narrowed it down to 2 based on your background, and I want you to serve on General MacArthur's staff. And he said, this other officer is a professor, a chemistry professor, and we're interviewing you 2, and one of you we're going to put on the staff. And, well, needless to say, he got it, I didn't, and but at least I was interviewed. And so General MacArthur was not there the day that I was there, and not that I would have seen him, but he was not there. But later I did see him. One day I was in the Philippines, in Manila, and the GHQ was a 2-story building, and I looked younger than I was at my age, and so the elevator was reserved for the general, and he had a habit of working every night. His habits were to work during the day, and then to take off for dinner, and then come back and work at night. And so I was in GHQ, and the MPs wouldn't let you get on the elevator because it was reserved for him. And he came and with a flourish, and then when he got on, and he motioned to me, and so I got on, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, where are you from, son? And I said, Atlanta, Georgia. He said, said, I've been there, nice town. And so about that time, we were up on the second floor, and he walked off. And I saw him again the night the war was over. They congregated out. First, we took pistols and shot, went down into a barrio, that's a village in the Philippines, and we would shoot up all just, it's a wonder we didn't kill somebody, but we were celebrating the war was over. So then we went down to Manila to GHQ, and there were thousands of GIs out in front yelling, "We want Doug, we want Doug." And he came out and he spoke, but I couldn't hear him, I was so far away. But then later I got to a real visit with him. He lived in the Waldorf Towers in New York City, and it was either the 35th floor or the 37th floor, I've forgotten which, but ex-President Hoover lived on one of the floors and he lived on the other. And so I was at a convention of the Reserve Officers Association, and we had a committee to go up. General MacArthur had just had kidney surgery, and he was not able to come to the convention to receive an award that we gave him, the Reserve Officers Association. And so we had a committee go up to him, and I went up to, I believe it was the 35th floor, and he had several officers there who directed us, and we went in, sat down, and a little while he came in, and he sat down and talked to us, and we had, I guess we spent probably an hour with him, and that was one of the thrills of my life, to visit with him. And that day I also went up on the elevator with the mayor of New York, and that night I heard hail to the chief, and I thought, night, is Eisenhower here or something? And I looked up, and there was ex-President Hoover tottering up to the dais, and so I thought that was a pretty successful day. I saw the mayor of New York, I think his name was Wagner, and MacArthur and ex-President Hoover all in the same day. And so, but I sort of got off the subject. Let's see, where were we? We were, anyway,
well, actually, I could ask, you're talking about the war being over, and the flyboys knowing something. When you heard about the atomic bomb being dropped, what went through your mind when you heard about that?
Well, it was so new, and we just couldn't believe that there was anything like that, and and naturally we thought here these flyboys were betting that the war would be over in 30 days, and then this happened. I think it was about maybe around August the 11th, something, I'm not sure of the date. They dropped the first one, and then a week or two later they dropped another one. The first one was on Hiroshima, and then the second one was on Nagasaki, and they dropped it, and we then believed that, well, in fact, after they dropped Nagasaki, I remember we were listening to a shortwave radio, and they said that the emperor had requested a session, or I've forgotten the terminology, but we would listen to shortwave radio. Even in New Guinea, we got that, and I remember this rather doleful voice would come on, "This is London," and we listened to that, and it was always London. We could get them, and we then. But to answer your question, frankly, I've forgotten the exact reaction I had, but it was one of good cheer that we were delighted that it looked like things might be over. And so they, when the war was over, they then came to me and said, you want to go to Colonel Campbell, who was the commander, and he said he wants to see you. And when I went there, he had about 5 other captains, and he said, we are going to promote all of you to major if you'll agree to serve 6 months more over here. And so one captain, Chet Good, that was his name, he said, well, I'll do it. And four of us said, nothing doing. But when I got to Fort McPherson for discharge, my promotion had already come, and I was promoted the day I arrived to major. And but this Chet Good, who agreed to stay, I don't know what happened to him or anything, but he agreed, and he was promoted immediately, right then and there. They pinned the leaves on him. But you see, all of this is pretty boring, and I'm sorry that I can't give you any blood and thunder.
Oh no, that's not the point, really. Actually, another question I've got is, how did you feel about the troops that served under you? To tell me a little bit about them and your thoughts on them and the relationship you had with them.
Well, I started off as a lieutenant, platoon leader in the 827 Tank Destroyer Battalion, and the troopers were all black, and the cadre for the unit came from the old, I guess it was the 10th Cavalry, and they were all cavalrymen who'd been in the horse. They had horses back then, and so they were excellent. They were. I know I had one who had been a dining car steward, and another one who had been jobs that in civilian life that you would think there's no there's no comparison with the units. With the job that they were doing in the Army. and but they were excellent. Some of them were not. Some of them, in fact, one of them, we had to carry a gun on him to get him to march. And we had a Lieutenant Parker who he marched in the rear with a gun. It was more or less a bluff. He wouldn't have shot him, I'm sure, but anyway, he made this guy think he would anyway. And but all told, it taught you one thing as an officer with black troops. You could give commands, you could give orders, but you had to follow up to be sure that they were carried out. Because if you didn't do that, chances are they would not be carried out. But when I got with white troops, when I gave orders and gave commands, they were carried out. And you didn't have to follow up, but you did through habit. And it really was good training as an officer to serve with black troops. And then when I got with white troops at Camp Roberts, California, I had excellent people who they had big jobs. I know one fellow came in and he had been a pro golfer at a big country club in Los Angeles, and he brought me some golf balls, a dozen balls with my name engraved on them. And I told him, I said, I can't accept these. I said, I can't accept any gifts like this. And he said, well, he got your name on them. And I said, yeah, but that'll make them easy to find. You use them because I just can't take them. And so anyway, some of them were outstanding. We had college professors and people that were real, and we had an excellent unit. I mean, we had great pride in the organization, and there wasn't a slacker in the bunch. We had, and then when I went overseas, the cadre that I had, the regular people with the unit, they were outstanding. I had a little Jewish boy named Lansky, and he was my company clerk, and he even outthought me. I'd tell him something to do, and he said, I've already done it. And just outstanding people. And my relationship with them was one of, but to go back to when I was with black troops, we had an officer from New Jersey, and his unit got up a petition to have him removed. Imagine that in the Army, a petition. And of course, nobody paid any attention to it, but they thought they would get him removed. And I had no problems serving with the black troops. And in fact, some of them I've even run into since I got out. And when I served as chairman of the parole board here in Georgia, I had one that I served with, and out of that unit come to me for a job. And so gave him a job, but he didn't show up when it came time to I don't know what happened to him, but you know, there was no problem at all with the relationship with the troops, and I'm sure we had a good unit in both in Camp Roberts and overseas, and we well, we had incidents. I know when my daughter was in I guess grammar school, she wanted to know about an experience that I had, and I told her about one. I said, well, one morning.
Actually, let me stop you. I'm sorry. This tape's about to run out.
Yeah.
I just want to put another one in, and we can continue.
Want some water?
No.
I